listening to Civic from the San Francisco Public Press. California is home to thousands of Native people, but removing them from their land wasn't the end of their struggles.
We are a community, yes. We're a strong community. The Board of Supervisors here, they have written letters for us. We've had letters written by a lot of people that have supported us. And the Park Service, how can you build a roundhouse on federal land if you're not a tribe, And we are a distinct tribe.
We talked to tribal leadership from the Southern Sierra Miwuk Nation, currently going through the federal acknowledgement process, to explore the bureaucratic challenges and learn about how not having official recognition affects the tribe. I am Jessica Prado, and this is Civic. 44 years ago, the Office of Federal Recognition, which works under the Department of Interior, drafted new regulations to establish a path to recognizing Indian tribes in the United States. But in recent years, the federal recognition process has become bogged down in political battles, especially over gaming concerns.
A battle over gambling and casinos is brewing between the Cherokee and Lumbee Indians. The U.S. House recently approved the Lumbee Recognition Act, but the Cherokee Nation wants to block it.
A Native American tribe based in Mariposa County is fighting for federal recognition.
The tribe is not technically recognized by the government. Its members have been working to be federally recognized since 1982 and say they are not giving up.
Everybody thinks that it's all about casinos and things like that, but it's much, much more than that.
Sandra Chapman is chairwoman of the Southern Sierra Miwuk Nation. She says these assumptions do not apply to her tribe.
People think about the Indians when they get recognized. The first thing they want to do is have a casino. That's not even on our radar. We don't even think like that. We want to just be able to protect our burial sites, be able to have our people where elders where we can have housing and stuff for them, where we'll be able to have our young adults have to move away to find jobs. In 1970, we start organizing our American Indian Council because we wanted to have a place at the table, be able to have a voice. So that's when we came together.
Obtaining federal recognition is often seen as the golden ticket because without a federal acknowledgement, it is very difficult for tribes, even one with state recognition, to organize collectively and have influence over their members. California has the highest Native American population in the country, and it's also home to the majority of non-federally recognized tribes.
I'm a direct descendant of Chief Tenaya. My lineage goes back to that, and my father and my grandfathers, they lived in and worked in Yosemite. So, we have had a real struggle because we don't have a lot of resources. When we become federally recognized, we'll be able to have more grants for our children. We'll be able to acquire land, and we will be able to have more resources come in.
As many as 600 indigenous tribes are still waiting to be acknowledged by the federal government, surpassing the number of recognized tribes in the country, which stands at just 574. Applications have slowly been processed over the years, but not steadily, as the application process is quite lengthy and vague. In California, since 1978, only the Death Valley Timbisha Shoshone Band has been recognized through this administrative process. The Southern Sierra Miwuk Nation submitted their letter of intent to become a recognized tribe in 1982.
We sent our papers in, our petition 40 years ago, and my elder was saying, he said, "Sandy, thank you for working on this." And I said, "No, it's our elders that put down the foundation, and we're just building off of it." We're right now, they have said that we're not a distinct Indian community. That was our proposed finding. We're looking to have that taken back and taken off.
In 2018, the Office of Federal Acknowledgement published a preliminary finding denying recognition to the Southern Sierra Miwuk Nation. But the tribe continues to plead its case and has local community support from the National Park Service. Yosemite National Park has an ongoing consultation relationship with 7 tribes, including the Southern Sierra Miwuk Nation, also known as the American Indian Council of Mariposa County. In a letter of support for the tribe's recognition, the Yosemite National Park noted, quote, This relationship has existed for over 40 years. They have brought to the discussion the unique interests and views of the distinct Indian community, whose ancestral ties to Yosemite National Park has spanned multiple generations and began prior to the establishment of the park, and which are reflected in the traditions, cultural values, and spiritual beliefs and practices of their community.
We are a community, yes. We're a strong community. The Board of Supervisors here, they have written letters for us. We've had letters written by a lot of people that have supported us. And the Park Service, how can you build a roundhouse on federal land if you're not a tribe, you know? And we are a distinct tribe.
Southern Sierra Miwuk youth reside in Mariposa County and as far as the Central Valley and the San Francisco Bay Area, and they travel all the way to Yosemite for their indigenous education and traditional ceremonies.
We stay together as a community. We have many things that we do. We have our bear ceremonies, and we have our spiritual camp, and we have the walk that we walk from Yosemite over to Farrington Ranch. We have big time in Yosemite every year, and we have our Mariposa powwow.
The tribe also has a federal acknowledgement committee in which members of the tribe consistently work on compiling records for their petition. The committee has maintained a relationship with the Office of Federal Acknowledgement for decades. The office manages this federal recognition process.
So we have a membership committee who've worked very hard on our memberships and getting everything compiled. We have our genealogy all documented. We have our offices just right next to us down here. So all of our papers are down there, which we sent to Office of Federal Recognition. But we've been put on hold now all this time, and then when we came up, then they give us like 180 days, and they would give us another 180 days. We're trying to get, it's called FOIA, it's Freedom of Information Act. We're trying to get that of everything that we've sent to them, and we've been trying that for 3 years, and we haven't received it yet.
Chapman says the pandemic contributed to the slowdown.
It was COVID, and then they were understaffed, and they've just put us off, you know. They just kept giving us excuses.
When the Office of Federal Acknowledgement issued its 2018 finding, it wrote that the Southern Sierra Miwuk Nation did not meet the community criterion that requires, quote, a predominant portion of the petitioning group comprises a distinct community and has existed as a community from historical times until the present, end quote.
We're sending in over, my niece is working, and we have workers that are compiling pictures because from 1982 to 2011, and showing that we have these gatherings, that we've had these powwows, that we have Christmas parties, we've had Halloween parties, Easter parties, and we all come together, you know, as those parties. And so we'll probably have like about 2,000 pictures that we've gotten from the families and brought all those pictures together, and they're getting them all down and the dates and everything. So we're going to overload them with all kinds of evidence. We're going to give them more than they asked for and see where they say now. And, you know, we're trying to get a meeting with Deb Holland, you know, because she actually came up to Wahoga and she met one of our elders up there. And so we're trying to get a meeting with her to have her look at us again, because she's in a very high place, and Secretary of Interior, we need to have her back us, and which she does back a lot of tribes, but they're federally recognized. She needs to reach out to the non-federally recognized tribes. Our tribe, you know, that's our family. We're one great big family. And so I am passionate that we become federally recognized. Our ancestors had wanted it. I remember my mom and dad saying they wanted to be recognized. It's the recognition that you get, that the government is saying, I know who you are. You know, I know who you are.
Applying for federal recognition is a complicated process. How does it work? First, A tribe must submit a letter of intent to the Office of Federal Acknowledgement, working with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, to petition to become a recognized tribe. Then, the tribe must collect all sorts of historical and anthropological evidence to prove their continuous existence as a tribe from the 1800s to the present. A few years back, in 2015, the burdensome amount of evidence was reduced. Now, tribes only have to show documentation of the tribe's activities and cohesion from the early 1900s to the present day, but this is still an often overwhelming challenge. We talk more in depth about the federal recognition process with Cristina Azocar, an Indigenous journalist and professor at San Francisco State University. She's a citizen of the Upper Mattaponi tribe, which is based in Virginia. Professor Azocar was inspired to write News Media and Indigenous Fight for Federal Recognition, a book that explains the gatekeeping process and barriers that her own tribe experienced for decades.
I got interested in this book because my own tribe, the Upper Mattaponi tribe, went through the federal recognition process over the last 30 or 40 years, and ultimately we were not able to get federal recognition through the federal acknowledgement process. And so we went through an act of Congress, which is a second way that a tribe can be federally recognized. And there's also the court process. And so what I wanted to do, because I am a journalism professor, was understand the relationship between the news media coverage of the federal recognition process and a tribe being able to get federally recognized by the federal government.
So we're going to start with Chapter 2, where you basically talked about who is Indian and who decides.
First of all, I think if we try to relate it back to the federal recognition process. So I know what happened in my own tribe and what happens with many other tribes is people from the government will look at us and say, well, you don't look Indian, right? And so the question is, what does an Indian look like? And that stereotype of what an Indian looks like is based on a very old historic stereotypes of Native people from the 15th century, basically. And so part of the problem is that when tribes are trying to prove their status as Indian tribes, the people who are often looking on the outside, people are only solely looking through a phenotype, which is a stereotype of what Native people look like. And if you look at Native people across the country and in Latin America and just really anywhere, any Indigenous people anywhere, there is no specific look. And unfortunately, that look is often used to decide whether a tribe is actually a tribe.
And you say like that those have an impact in the federal recognition process because those ideas carry over to how they view the application, correct?
Well, sort of. So, and I'm going to go back and talk about a little bit about my tribe, and because it's what I know a lot, and that's really why I decided to do this book, is because I saw the racism in the process toward my tribe. And so in 1924 in Virginia, there was this act called the Racial Integrity Act. So the person in charge of the Virginia Bureau of Vital Statistics was named Walter Plecker. And he decided that there were no Indians left because he looked at the tribes and he said, you know, they're either really white or they're really black, and so we're going to get rid of all Indians. And with this Racial Integrity Act, he reclassified all Indigenous people in Virginia as either black or white. So when tribes have to go through the federal acknowledgement process, through the Office of Acknowledgement, they have to prove historical continuity. But our tribe could not do that because in 1924, there were no Indians left. Because with the sweep of a hand, a paper genocide, this Walter Plecker person was able to get rid of all Indians. But in the federal recognition process, the current one that came into law in 2015, tribes have to go back to the year 1900, but we could not do that. And so one person got to decide what an Indian looked like. And because he didn't think that any of us looked like Indians anymore, he decided there were none of us left. And so our tribe could not get recognized through that labor-intensive process of documentation.
And then some of the things that they ask for evidence is kind of like you're saying, like membership lists. One thing that I wanted to get into is like how difficult is it to gather this evidence?
Right. So it's really difficult because often a tribe can't do it itself. It has to hire historians, it has to hire anthropologists, and these often cost money unless somebody's willing to do it for free. And so you'll see that, for instance, we were looking at the Southern Miwuk tribe, and I was looking at their documentation, and I believe that they submitted the letter of intent, which is the first part of the process. So a tribe has to submit a letter of intent to the Office of Acknowledgement, And then the Office of Acknowledgement will then send a letter back saying, we received your intent to be federally recognized, and now you have to go get all the documentation. And so then there's these lag times because it takes so long for tribes to gather the documentation. And also you have to think that a lot of tribes, we didn't know that we were going to have to go through this, so documentation wasn't necessarily kept. And also because of paper genocide, whether it was federal government or state government or city government, they didn't want those records because they didn't want to have any proof that there were tribes. And so to gather all this evidence takes an incredibly long time. It's very labor intensive. And in many ways, those records don't exist. And so some tribes have had to really try to outsource it. There have been tribes who have been able to work with universities to gather the information, but it does cost money and then it takes time. And so then what happens is that sometimes tribal leadership changes, or the people who were involved in gathering the documentation, they don't have the resources to do it themselves anymore, and so then the process stops. And there isn't any time after that letter of intent is filed that the documentation has to be submitted. And so you can see, for instance, on our tribe, I think the first date was 1979, but it really wasn't until 10 or 15 years later that that follow-up was done because the intensity it takes to gather this documentation. I have an example in the book of one tribe, the Little Shell tribe, and the Office of Acknowledgement suggested that it gather phone records of tribal members who had conversations with each other. And I thought, that's crazy. How would you actually be able to go about doing that? And so the office does not make it easy to gather this information. And it is also a bureaucratic instrument of the government. So it does not help tribes do this.
The Southern Sierra Miwuk Nation from getting recognized is because, so they did go through a review process, and then basically the federal government came back and said that they're not a distinctive community, which to their surprise is like, we have our own ceremonies, we have our own government, we do have our own membership, but yet that's not enough. So one thing that they're asking them is evidence of them like communicating with each other. We didn't have email or like consistently, we didn't have cell phones back then either. So how do you keep track of like them having conversations with each other since back to the 1900s, right? It is a challengeful thing to do because we really got to think about the historical context in which this evidence lived.
Right. Yeah. And if you think about a tribe that's in Yosemite, right? So the tribe is in Yosemite. So the federal government has an interest in making sure that they don't have any rights over Yosemite, because then that interrupts the tourism, it interrupts commerce. And in many situations, the rhetoric around news coverage has to do with how a tribe getting federal recognition is somehow going to interrupt what's happening in a community. But it doesn't take into account what's happening in the tribal community.
When they started working more with the national park, so they were able to actually get a 30-year lease just to be able to build like a ceremonial roundhouse in the park and kind of reconstruct Oaxaca village again. But then it's a lease, right? It's not something that is permanent. So it's like, we kind of acknowledge you, but just like for 30 years and then we'll talk again, right? So how do you think that kind of dynamic works?
Well, federal recognition leads to a sovereign relationship with the U.S. government, and that's really what federal recognition is. It's the acknowledgement by the U.S. government that the tribe is a sovereign entity and it has a one-to-one government relationship with the United States, and so that it makes it easier for the tribe to negotiate with the United States, just like it makes it easier for Mexico or Canada to negotiate and form alliances and do all the things that governments do. Without that federal recognition, a tribe does not have that power. So if the tribe had federal recognition, it would potentially have more power to have not just a lease, but have a stand to reclaim some of the territory. And so if you think reclamation of territory is not necessarily in the interest of the federal government.
And that comes with the federal recognition, being able to reclaim.
Well, it's a long process to be able to reclaim land, and land has to be taken into trust by the government. And then all these other things need to happen. That is also a very long process, but a tribe cannot even start that process necessarily without that. The states are different, right? So this is one of the complexities of recognition, is that some states have state-recognized tribes. And so they have relationships with states, but they don't have relationships with the federal government. And without that relationship with the federal government, tribes are not eligible for federal assistance with health and education. Basically, federal recognition is a way to protect Native people from American settlers.
You mentioned in your book that in Virginia, they had given state recognition to the tribes, and in a way that also helped them be able to obtain the evidence that they needed, that they have a relationship with the government, and then be able to obtain that recognition. So do you think like having that state recognition that allowed them to kind of step up into that process?
It makes it easier because there is the recognition that a tribe has existed historically. And that's one piece of the federal recognition, is that proof that the tribe has existed historically. So in a sense, that is one of the helpful pieces of evidence that a tribe needs. So if California isn't necessarily doing that, then it makes it more difficult for a tribe potentially to get federal recognition. One of the complications is that every tribe is really different. And so we can't necessarily apply the same types of thinking for every tribe. And so in the new criteria for federal acknowledgement that went into play in 2015, the guidelines were supposed to try to be more flexible so that there was this recognition that tribes are not homogenous, that tribes keep records or don't keep records in certain things, and communications look different in certain tribes.
So basically, in 1978, since the first federal recognition criteria was established, 18 tribes were recognized, which is what you mentioned in your book. So when this process began, there were 400 tribes that were not federally recognized. And now, in fact, today, there are almost 600 tribes that are not federally recognized. So it almost surpasses the number of tribes that we have recognized. So it makes you wonder, what does this tell us about the process, and why is there a backlog in processing all these applications?
Right. So I tried to get the Office of Acknowledgement to answer many questions about the process and why it took so long and how they hired people to do the review and who did the review. And I was not able to get that information. Lee Fleming, who is in charge of the office, I talked to him and he asked me to send my questions, and then he didn't answer, and then I kept following up, and in the end, he never did answer the questions. And when I was about to go to print, I said, I'm going to give you one more time because it would really be great to have these questions. And so I print the questions as an appendix in the book so people will know the questions I wanted to ask. But part of it is also government bureaucracy, right? This is the federal government. I don't think that there's a lot of people working in this office. It's probably underfunded. And so if you have few people and few resources to go through the recognition process, and imagine that in some cases there's thousands and thousands of documents that a tribe is going to submit. It didn't used to be that many documents, but as the process has gotten more and more rigorous, even though there is nothing that say that it necessarily has to meet a certain standard, but there's precedent that has been set that it's going to be the more records, the better. And so you have thousands and thousands of pieces of evidence, and somebody's got to go through those pieces of evidence. And so as the process continues, more tribes are trying to also collect that evidence. And so I think that it's sort of a process of tribes that are going through it, are collecting evidence and submitting it, and then other tribes are finding that they also have potential more access to records because there are more digital records now. And so then tribes are looking at the process.
It does take so long, which I find that very surprising, because I feel like, you have one application that is representing hundreds, if not thousands of people. And then if you're not allocating enough resources to be able to review them on time or in a timely manner, then who is doing the work in the department?
This length of the process is just a government bureaucratic process. And there's also a finite number of resources, right? So I'm sure that the Office of Federal Acknowledgement wants to make sure that tribes are tribes. But on the other hand, tribes know that they're tribes, but they're trying to gather this evidence. So there's this conflict between the two groups that comes into play, that one's trying to have a rigorous process, and then the tribes are trying to also protect their people. So I'm talking about the Little Shell Tribes process of federal recognition, and this is in Chapter 10. By 2007, the Native American Rights Fund had spent 29 years and more than 3,400 attorney hours on the federal recognition of the Little Shell Tribe of Chippewa Indians of Montana. The cost at that time was already in excess of $1 million, including attorney time and the experts hired to do the technical work. It was finally recognized as part of the National Defense Authorization Act in 2020, but only after 12 years of Montana Senator John Tester introducing the bill each year beginning in 2007. So that just gives you a little sense of what it costs, and even how having a representative who is wanting the tribe to be federally recognized, what they have to go up against in order for the process to actually happen. And if you think about it, especially during COVID, so tribes that had federal recognition were much more able to take care of their people than tribes without federal recognition. They had resources for health. My own tribe, we were sent tests, we were sent masks.
One thing that I was also reading in your book is there's a lack of transparency with the process, and even the people that work there don't feel comfortable in the way in which they're reviewing the applications. Can you just tell me a little bit more about that, the lack of transparency?
So one of the questions that I asked of Lee Fleming was specifically about the federal recognition of the Lumbee tribe. And the Lee Fleming is of a tribe that opposes the Lumbee recognition, and yet he's the head of the Office of Federal Acknowledgement. And so one of my questions was, is there a conflict of interest code? And how does that come to play? And again, I don't know because that question was never answered, and I have never been able to get that question answered. I also had a person who had worked closely on the new process, and that person would not let me use their name because they did not want them to know that they had given me this information, which I also found interesting, right? The person was really helpful. It's very, very heavily legal information. And without that knowledge of all of this law and these codes, it was really hard for me to weed through the red tape. And I had the luxury of time and resources being an academic, and tribes don't necessarily have that luxury. And then to me, that was really one of the goals of the book. Is it's not a long book, but I wanted it to be really a resource for journalists and for other people interested in the federal acknowledgement process of tribes.
There was a chapter in your book that it was federal recognition does not equate casinos. Sandra Chapman also told me that they don't want to be recognized in order to put a casino. They just really want their basic rights. And you have mentioned it, health, education, and employment and housing.
My tribe actually had to, in its federal recognition, which is through an act of Congress again, had to forego any future rights of having a casino. Even though in Virginia at the time, there was no casino gambling available. And so I think that the news media has conflated this idea that tribes that are federally recognized are only doing so in order to get a casino. And that's just not true. And in fact, when my tribe was going through the process, I was at a hearing with my Uncle Kenny Adams, who was the chief of the tribe, and he was testifying before the Senate Indian Affairs Committee, and John McCain was the head of that committee. And John McCain asked him, point blank, if you get federal recognition, aren't you going to open a casino? And my uncle at the time, and I think this is 2007, said, well, no, we're Baptists and we don't have any interest in having a casino. But even though the tribe never brought it up, the news media keeps bringing it up. And since 1987, the Cabazon decision legalizing gambling in Indian country, that changed the notion that the news media was covering tribes' federal recognition, if covered at all, because of the sovereignty. And all of a sudden, it only became because of casinos. But let me just read you a small passage, and this is from Arlinda Locklear. Arlinda Locklear is Lumbee, and she is the first licensed Native woman to argue a case before the Supreme Court. And this chapter came out of an interview that I did with her, and she sums it up in one paragraph. Locklear succinctly described the complicated years-long process. First, you have to get the land. Then you have to get the environmental impact statement. Then you've got to get it placed into trust. And then you have to get the Secretary of the Interior to determine if that land is eligible for gaming if it was acquired in trust after 1988. The tribe will then need to hire gaming lawyers if it wants a casino. For Class 3 gaming, it needs a compact with the state. Class 2 gaming, which consists of bingo and related games, including electronic versions of those games, can take place without a compact under IGRA, but other laws and regulations need to be followed. Either way, it takes another year, and inevitably, someone will sue to stop the gaming. Often this is someone in Las Vegas. This tells you a little bit about how complicated it actually is to get a casino, and so the idea that a tribe only wants federal recognition to get a casino is false.
So some of the things that I also wanted to touch upon is the different paths that it takes to become federally recognized. If I understand correctly, there's the administrative process, an act of Congress, or also the courts, which can be more expensive and time-consuming. But what does each path entail, and which would be the most beneficial for the tribe to be able to go and be recognized?
The federal acknowledgement process is the main path that tribes take. And it's the preferred path of the government because it means that this documentation was collected, that there was a fair process for all tribes to go through so that it's perceived as a more objective process. However, because of the difficulty in collecting the documentation needed in the federal acknowledgement process, a lot of tribes can't do it. And so that's how my tribe started, was through the federal acknowledgement process. But then at some point it realized, especially with the not being able to produce records past 1924 because of the Racial Integrity Act, that there's no way that we could ever get federal recognition through that process, or that it would be very, very difficult. And so what we did was we went through an act of Congress, and many tribes go through an act of Congress because of the difficulty of collecting the documentation. So basically what an act of Congress is that the tribe lobbies its state representatives and asks the representatives to put forth a bill to get the tribe federally recognized. And so in my tribe's case, that's what they did. They started in 2005, and then they would start, and then it would get stalled. And so then every time a new Congress came in, then they had to start the whole process again. So every 2 years, they had to start the process until finally there was a movement. And in 2018, that's how we became federally recognized. And in many ways, this is the only path that a lot of tribes will be able to take, is getting that acknowledgement through their state legislators that end up going through the congressional process and then ultimately being signed by the President of the United States. So it's not just through the Congress, but it has to be signed by the President. Then the other process of this is the court process, which doesn't happen very often. There was supposedly be a path for tribes to use a court process, but because of the administrative process, this has not actually been done. And so one of the people that I interviewed for the book was a person who worked for the Native American Rights Fund. His name is Dan Leverins. He's a lawyer. And he's the one who was telling me about this process, and he was trying to find for me somebody who had gone through the court process. And he couldn't find anybody at that time. So it exists, but it's not necessarily something that somebody's gone through. Although I briefly ran across a news story about a tribe going through the court process.
I was also doing a little bit of research, and something that I found is that usually when you go through the court process, you gotta realize you're taking on the federal government. So you really have to pull a lot of resources to go against them in court. So one of the things is like usually the courts would side with the government because the agency already went through the process of the review and doing all these things. So it's really difficult to like go against their argument. So then I found like there really is no way to appeal once the review has been given, which I think is also unfortunate because now tribes are not allowed to reapply if they get denied. Can you just tell me a little bit about what has changed? Because they had regulations that they had established in 1994.
So the goal of the 2015 regulations was to make the process more transparent and to make it more flexible for tribes to recognize that all tribes are not homogenous. But it doesn't seem to have changed much, right? So one of the main things is that tribes historically had to go back pre-1900, and with the 2015 criteria, it changed to from the year 1900 forward. But you still have to collect all that evidence. And so some of it changed, but in reality, as I think that you have found in looking at the Sierra Miwuk, is that they chose to go through the 1994 process, even though they could have switched. And that's probably because they had already had all this evidence and they didn't really want to start again. Because I was thinking, why would they have done that? Because it seemed slightly easier, but they already had so much evidence that they did not want to really start the process again. And so I think that that's an important thing to think about is maybe if they have to go through the new process, then there is less evidence just because records aren't kept the same way, because there's more digital documentation, but tribes might not have necessarily kept that digital documentation. Or again, you don't think about it, right? You're not thinking in the early 18th century or the early 19th century. It's like, I need to make sure that we have this evidence that we're talking to each other and we're communicating with each other in order for 100 years in the future to make sure that we have this relationship with the government.
It almost is kind of incredible that they ask for those kind of requirements. I mean, even like an average person can't trace their ancestry back that long ago, right? Without the resources, without like a path towards like getting to know those answers, it is extremely difficult.
To the point of the Office of Federal Acknowledgement, though, they do want to make sure that tribes that are federally recognized are tribes. And so it also has a role because there are few resources to go around. And so their argument would be it's not that we're trying to prevent tribes from becoming recognized. This is that we want to make sure that the tribes that are recognized are actually tribes. I tend to side with the tribes is because I see how difficult the process is. And I do wish that the Office of Federal Acknowledgement would be more forthcoming in what the resources it has and who does what. But it also, without having that information, we don't necessarily have their side of why it takes so long.
I was trying to look for the guidelines, but they only give you those 7 criteria, which it could go a lot of ways, right? Just in the terms of what you have to actually give them.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There are also some historical policies that have prevented from preserving this evidence. You talked about in your book about the Jim Crow laws and the census. Can you tell me a little bit about how those 2 things have prevented the preservation of evidence?
Right. Well, the Jim Crow laws is just this Racial Integrity Act that I was talking about in 1924 in Virginia. And so when you get rid of on paper that there are no more Indians, then you can't trace your ancestry back past the 1924 because somebody just said that there are no more Indians left. So that really is an outpost of Jim Crow. If you think about African Americans, there's the 1 drop rule. For Indians, there's the many drop rule. So you have to be, again, and it just goes back to phenotype. There's a historical idea of what an Indian is supposed to look like. That's a racist stereotype of what Indians are supposed to look like. And so that plays a role and just in the process. And then the census, Indians didn't get counted in the census until 1850. So there's no records of Indians before 1850. So that is also a problem with getting historical documentation when tribes weren't even part of the count of our country.
What could they do if they do get their application denied? If you went through this whole process, Miwok people have been doing it for 40 years, and then they're trying to be really careful about doing that final review. I mean, this is why they also submitted a FOIA request so they could see what they have actually submitted, their ancestors have submitted for them, so they can basically pick up from where they left off. But I mean, it's difficult because even the FOIA request is taking more than 3 years to get anything back, so that they keep extending the deadline in order for them to be able to submit this evidence.
The next avenue is going through the Act of Congress. So they would need their representatives, local, state, federal representatives, to move the federal recognition forward through an Act of Congress. That's really the only recourse that they have if they are denied.
And do you think maybe our California senators will be on board of doing something like that? Or have you seen them be in talks of recognizing any other tribes?
Not that I can think of. One of the issues is that since the government changes all the time, again, that's what happened with my own tribe, is that we started it, but then the representatives changed, and then we had to keep starting it again. So some representative might take it up and say yes, but then that person is no longer in office, or the committee gets changed, so it's difficult. And so even if it does happen, it will probably take the tribe more and more years in order to get recognized if they decide to go that route.
It is kind of difficult also to lobby a new
Right.
senator.
I mean, you have to, plus you have to pay lobbyists. It's not a free process. So imagine, my tribe was in Virginia, it was very close to Washington, D.C. The tribe in California, they're having to fly back and forth to D.C. and get lobbyists and people to lobby. And that's very expensive. And most tribes don't have those resources. Tribes that are not federally recognized, where are they going to get the resources in order to do that kind of travel, to go back and forth and to pay lobbyists?
So basically, if we're not able to have lobbyists, is there anything that the community can do to basically support our tribes?
Well, I think that it's every individual's responsibility to know the tribes that are in their area and to understand what tribes might be doing to support their cultures, to support if there are any fund drives. However, you also think that there's also the consideration that maybe people don't want their tribes to be federally recognized. So it's really, unfortunately, up to the tribes to get the word out and try to raise money for federal recognition. But it is important for all of us to know what tribes are in our communities, and which are still in our communities, not historically, but currently in our communities and historically, and how what we do impacts their role to survive. I think that my advice is really for people to understand, for non-tribal members to understand what the federal recognition process means. It means that tribes have the ability to take care of their community members through health, through education, and through other services that the government promised us when they stole our land hundreds of years ago and continue to steal our land now.
In Part 2, we'll be taking a closer look at the tribe's challenges without federal recognition and their efforts to strengthen their community. I'm Jessica Prado, and you'll be listening to Civic. Civic is produced by KSFP-LP, a project of the San Francisco Public Press. Our team includes producer Liana Wilcox, contributor Sylvie Sturm, and contributor Mel Baker, who's also program director for KSFP. Lila LaHood is the publisher of the Public Press. Michael Stoll is our executive director. Our theme music is by John Dillon. A special thank you to Sandra Roan Chapman, chairperson of the Southern Sierra Miwuk Nation, for sharing her tribe's story, and Cristina Azocar for walking us through this federal process, using research from her new book, News Media and Indigenous Fight for Federal Recognition. Learn more about the Southern Sierra Miwuk Nation and upcoming events at southernsierramiwuknation.org. Thanks for listening.